This is PNP Live and Direct. And I'm joined in this discussion by Mr. Nishkom Williams, who is the Vice President of the People's National Party Youth Organization.
Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. And while we're here, we'll be discussing a number of issues which have been raised during the course of this election campaign. And we will also try to point out during the course of our discussion why is it that you must vote for the People's National Party as against the Jamaica Labour Party. And that we'll be doing by looking at some of the issues that have gone on during the course of the week, and also issues which we anticipate or will be anticipating during the course of the campaign. There will be quite a number. And also post-election. We're going to begin with this live stream with some newsworthy items. Firstly, COVID-19. COVID-19 is of big interest in the country just now. In fact, people have been asking all kinds of different questions. One, should we be having an election during COVID-19?
That's the biggest one for me.
That's the biggest one for you. That's what you're hearing out there also. The party stated quite clearly that they believe that the election was called in order to satisfy the interest of the Jamaica Labour Party and the government. In other words, putting the risk of our people, the health risk of our people, before the country. And some people respond by saying, then how come you had gone ahead and agreed that we should have a national election? If it is that you believe that the Prime Minister is in fact called the election because he is of the view that it ought to be called, how come the People's National Party
Well, I expressed my views on this matter on Twitter several times.
Right.
Dr. Peter Phillips is a political organization, so it is his duty to lead as a politician, right? The Prime Minister, he has the job of calling the election, and he knows that the elections were not due, we have until next year. I think he was very premature in calling the election, but we would have seen different things leading up to it. So you see the road work,
Yes.
advancement in road work taking place now
Yes.
across their target seats.
Right.
So you see those things and you know that they're about to call election. So as an opposition, you start to prepare yourself because you don't want to be caught off guard.
Right. In other words, what you're saying is that the Prime Minister, as Prime Minister, has the constitutional right to call the elections. So even although the People's National Party has been prepared and been preparing for a national election, we have absolutely no control
We have no control
over when it is called.
Right, and there are several persons raising questions about why we said, okay, fine, no problem, let's go.
Yeah.
But as I said, as the leader of a political party, you don't have much of a choice.
Yeah.
If they say it is time for an election, it is a contest or you don't.
Yeah, the duty of the People's National Party is to contest the elections unless you can find valid grounds not to contest it. And if the Jamaica Labour Party were to go through with it, with the PNP being out, then of course they would be the only one offering a choice
Right.
to the people.
Right.
So this argument about the People's National Party asking for and calling for the election that the Prime Minister hasn't called it, they are now saying that the Prime Minister has put the country at risk in terms of the health of its people. To
And
me,
it is expected that the cases, the COVID-19 cases will spike 3 times the amount now
Yeah.
after the election because everybody will be out mixing and mingling. I know they have put in some new regulations, but it is politics, how I view it. It is like a party. So those who go to events, how excited they are to go to their events, they go out and take off their mask. They forget that they should have on a mask. They're drinking, they're chatting, they're hugging instead of the elbow touches. And you really forget what you should be doing because you're in a place of comfort. And politics is that place for many persons. They are comfortable, so they take off their mask.
the other question that you'll hear asked out there too, having dealt with that issue, is how come the People's National Party is saying that it is adhering to the protocols, yet on nomination day, thousands of People's National Party supporters and also supporters of the Jamaica Labour Party were out there, some masked, some without masks, some at a sit. By the way, I would like people watching this live stream to know that we are 6 feet apart. So I don't want you to say that we are not wearing the mask. We are not wearing the mask because we are 6 feet apart. We are in fact ensuring that the protocol are observed. But back to the question though, how will you respond to those who say?
If we are to be truthful,
Yeah.
I think leaders and among the bias of both parties would love to adhere to these rules, and they'd love to ensure that their supporters adhere to the rules as well. So you give out masks, and I saw both parties giving out masks. You give them out and you tell them, wear your mask, you give them sanitizers, you tell them to sanitize, you tell them no hugging, don't be too close, socially distance, but it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because like I said, it is a place of comfort. We are not, it hasn't been going on long enough, and persons are not sufficiently scared of it for it to be fully enforced.
In other words, what I hear you saying, although we're not trying to make an excuse for people not adhering to the protocol, it's a culturally very difficult for
It is
Jamaicans
absolutely difficult.
to
But
adjust, but we must.
I can tell you in West Rural St. Andrew what Crystal did. Crystal ensured that she would have seen enough supporters
I wonder why
but
they raise that particular
at
constitution.
different locations. So she would not have brought everybody to the nomination center. You brought the maximum or close to the maximum that I said you could bring, and then you go to different communities.
I think before we move on, the People's National Party leadership stated quite clearly, publicly, that they would reach for their supporters to adhere to the protocol. But once nomination day was announced, that cultural norm kicked in, and there were quite a number of persons.
And I know what they also did was give out the
Masks
that were printed.
Yes.
So it becomes a part of the swag. People want to wear it to go to school. But
and
again,
people were sanitizing.
right, so I saw Hugo had some sanitizers. I seen
With Hugo, that's what people asked him.
Graham.
Graham. Graham, who is in
Right.
political
Right, so he had some sanitizers labeled, and I saw persons with them.
Yeah.
But you put them in your pocket and you back to normal. So you try to enforce it, but everybody won't adhere.
But one of the things that we need to do from a party standpoint, the really difficult, as difficult as it may be, to ensure that we adhere to the protocols and appeal to people to adhere to the protocols. So the mask, the social distancing, the hand sanitizer, and so on. There's another issue which we also need to focus on as it relates to COVID-19. There are 4 parishes, if you will recall, 4 parishes. Kingston, St. Andrew, St. Catherine, and I think Carrington, also now under quarantine. There are a number of issues arising from it. First of all, in fact, 7. No, 7. Huh? No, the time. Yes, ma'am. So we are talking about 4 parishes, and the time, the curfew time, is now from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m.
Today
And
until September 2.
interestingly,
September 2. So
After
we're opening it back
September 2.
up for election.
So it's going to be open for election. But one of the things I want to ask you though, is to what extent do you believe that the curfew that is in place and also the quarantine in these parishes will affect preparation for election on the ground?
I think
Particularly your party.
I think it affects it significantly,
Oh,
drastically, because especially in the battleground cities, it is difficult for you to campaign only between those hours. Right? You have persons who will be coming in from work who you go on to see after they get in from work. This restricts that. Right? So this limits you.
it's a new normal. It's a new normal for practitioners of politics in Jamaica, as is for everything else.
It's just unfortunate that the election has been called, and we don't have to. It's almost as if you have to keep a switch.
But some people point and say, what Trinidad did? Trinidad just concluded
Trinidad,
election
I don't think Trinidad was at 200 cases and they closed their borders.
Trinidad was much tighter than Jamaica in
Their
terms
borders
of the
were completely
implementation of
closed.
protocol.
Yeah.
They had the election, and what happened after the election? After the election, there was a spike.
Right.
So something that we have to take into consideration here, and the reason why we have to be so stringent in terms of the protocol is to try and ensure that whatever happens after the election is something which the People's National Party, I'm sure you think will form the government.
Of course.
We'll have to deal with it thereafter. And moving right along, the delay in terms of the opening of school. I recall the Minister of Education saying recently, at the annual conference of the Jamaica Teachers Association that with the election being September the 3rd and school being required to open the Monday thereafter, that they are going to be doing everything in their power to try and ensure that the school properly sanitized. And of course, teachers would say that's a short period of time, so are you in agreement with the pushback?
What was interesting to me is when they had the emergency press conference, at that point in time, they were unable to communicate what would be done for education. It's important for me to prioritize education, right? I was disappointed that they weren't clear on what to do. Now I got the release hours after, say October 5th. I still don't know if that's a realistic time. There's still parents who are saying, not my child. My child will be homeschooled. You know, there's still teachers who are not prepared because I think some schools are trying to do half online, half
face-to-face,
right? But that now means that these teachers have to prepare their homes to make them more comfortable so that they're able to do that. Some of them don't live in those conditions.
Yeah, I think the fact that the time has been pushed back is a good thing. And it also indicates to me that the fact that the government can push back school but have an election now which will be on the 3rd of September is a big contradiction because you're asking people together for party political reasons, and then in terms of the education institution they're asking the students have to come together until sometime in October. But be that as it may, it's also a new normal for the schools and for the teachers. The question is whether or not the government, the guilty government, has given us sufficient indication that they are on top of things as it relates to preparation for COVID-19.
What I haven't heard much of is the implications on the students. Right? There are many students who are at home, with parents who are unable to teach them things that they need to know. These are part of the curriculum. Many of them have parents who are unable to keep it that they don't have that level of education. Or they're at work. Right.
Don't have the resources.
They could be at work, they don't have tablets, or they have one computer in the household. How do you split between school and work?
Do you know that despite all the promises of the Jamaica River Party government, that they have not instituted one tablet in school since 2016 to date? I heard the minister with responsibility for energy and technology saying in the House recently that it will start very soon. I don't know how soon is soon after 4 years, but the fact of the matter is that not one tablet has in fact been instituted in school. And I don't want people out there who are listening to this live program to believe that the tablets that we're talking about is one that they never could have made. It is not that we're talking about tablets that are being used in school. They are giving me the indication that I need for that. This is Commissioner Williams, Vice President of the People's National Party Youth Organization, and this is Delano Franklin, who is hosting PNP Live. We'll take a break now and we'll return very soon.
Building your Kingston, building Clarendon, building your Central, Portland to Westmoreland, building your St. Bess, building St. Catherine, yes, St. Mary now get left, and over to the west, building up St. James, St. Thomas have the wave, building Manchester name, Trelawney we are clear, hey, building your Jamaica, PNP does a build it up, building your Jamaica, PNP does a build it up, build it up, build it up, hospital and school, farmer plant more food, build it up, more factory like a road that improve, build it up, put the X beside the head, that's what you're gonna do, build it up, we are build Jamaica for me and you.
The proceeding was a paid announcement by the People's National Party. People's National Party.
Building your Kingston, building Clarendon, building your Central, Portland to Westmoreland, building your St. Bess, building St. Catherine, yes, St. Mary now get left, and over to the west, building up St. James, St. Thomas have the wave, building Manchester name, Trelawney we are clear, hey, building your on you.
The proceeding was a paid announcement by the People's National Party.
Live and direct. And with us is Ms. Danishka Williams, who is the Vice President of the People's National Party Youth Organization. During the course of the week, the party hosted a virtual press conference with the General Secretary of the party, Julian Robinson, being the host. And the objective of that press conference was to look at COVID-19. COVID-19 is real serious now. There has been a spike in numbers. There are many businesses and places that have been calling in to say that they are concerned about the employees who might be so affected. The question of whether or not resources are available, all of these things. So the press conference brought together 3 members of the People's National Party, 2 MPs and a caretaker in the form of Dr. Leighton Campbell. What are the other 2? Yes. Sitting MP also. Right, Shane Alexis was in Southeast St. Mary. There were 3 medical practitioners, and we will be looking at what they had to say during the course of that press conference.
This has come about because of certain poor management decisions that has been taken by the government. The first thing is that they painted a picture that it's either you open the country or you would die from economic collapse. Jamaica at the same time did not pay attention to high-risk areas and to ban entrance from these areas. They prioritized tourists over the locals. Whilst the Ministry of Tourism was boasting about the numbers of persons that were coming into the country, the Ministry of Health was not doing what was necessary to ensure that we would be able to test these persons and get back the test within time so that the appropriate management decisions could be taken. They mismanaged the pre-testing protocol, which has led to a part of this ongoing increases that you have been seeing. We have a low capacity for testing of entrance at our borders. You will realize that testing at the airport was very poor because persons took a very inordinate, a long time to get back their results. Some persons even left the country without having a test result. We have a large backlog of cases are had, making contact tracing population larger and harder to trace these persons and effectively manage the individuals who are positive. We had poor management of the quarantine of our returning Jamaicans. With the geofencing, we know of individuals who pretty much just turn on their phones and leave it at home and they go out on the road. So there needs to be proper quarantine of these individuals with proper checks and balances to ensure that these persons are indeed in quarantine. The government had no real plan for frequent testing of hotel workers. We are now in the middle of a second spike with an increase in local transmission with supply chain issues concerning the PPEs. The minister says that we have all the necessary PPEs, but when you speak to the persons who are on the ground in the facilities, they're saying they don't have it, which means that there's a supply chain issue affecting that. And there needs to be a PPE manager maybe in the hospitals to ensure that sufficient PPEs are in the facilities and that persons are protected. This spike is also taking place with a general election campaign ongoing, and we have ballooning numbers of cases that are under investigations, which tells us that we are probably in the phase of community spread. With all this, the fact of the matter is that these things could have been prevented if different decisions were taken with the management of these issues. And so the government cannot escape taking the blame for allowing these cases to increase to this level and across so many different parishes.
That was Dr. Leighton Campbell speaking during the course of the week at a press conference which was called by the People's National Party. He made some very serious points during the course of his presentation, one of which is that we are now in a phase of community spread. And he also spoke about the way the government has been handling the crisis or mismanaging the crisis. But we also had other speakers at the press conference. Dr. Shane Alexis also spoke, and one of the issues being raised and discussed It's whether or not this government is a government of action, it's a government of market need, which is public relations. And Shane Alexis
I think we know
spoke
the
to
answer to that.
Dr. Shane Alexis.
Medicine is a science. You cannot hide the truth. The country deserves to know each day at a specific time how many cases of COVID-19 are with us so that we can make clear decisions such as reopening of schools or having them postpone the reopening of schools as needed. We can make better decisions for our business community so that the small businesses right across the island can survive. The PR show by the Prime Minister and Dr. Tufton is not sufficient to save lives. We now have over 1,200 cases and more to come. 15 people have died, leaving their families behind. What are we going to tell those families? That simply we didn't know or we were not prepared? As a government in waiting, we are prepared to take decisions on the first day to ensure that our capacity is increased, not just financially, but to ensure that our staff is motivated and refreshed. We cannot afford to have doctors at home or any other level of staff simply at home unemployed waiting for an opportunity to serve their country. We must ensure that all hands are on deck, that the private sector, the public sector, our trade unions, our grassroots community associations such as the 4-H Club, the Agricultural Society, the youth clubs are all engaged to get the message across. The government said that the mission was accomplished too early. They took their foot off of the gas in terms of proceeding to ensure that we could withstand any challenge to our healthcare service. Complacency is leading us down the wrong road. We need transparency and clarity on the true position, and we must also ensure that we are listening to those most qualified to guide the process. Those are the technical experts in the Ministry of Health. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Health are not trained in this area. They are not qualified to begin to lead the country to deal with a pandemic. We must now ensure, as a party, that we remain united, that we win the next general election to rescue all our Jamaican brothers and sisters from this COVID-19 pandemic.
That's Dr. Shane Alexis, also one of the presenters during the press conference held by the People's National Party this week, looking at COVID-19. Dr. Alexis is a medical doctor. There are some doctors who are not medical doctors. But he, along with Dr. Clayton Campbell, who was here before, and Maurice Guy, who will come from, they are medical doctors. So they are practitioners in the field.
So
And
they
will
understand the day-to-day issues that they have to face when it's on this country.
Absolutely. So when they speak of the lack of resources, for example, in hospitals, when they speak of, I heard Dr. Alexis saying that the government ought to listen to the professionals. What he's saying is that we are the ones who are out in the field, we are the doctors who are out there, the nurses are out there. We need to listen to what we are saying and stop embarking on this public relations in order to be able to cover some of the things.
I think what
yes,
this government has done is put persons in management positions who have no idea what it is like to manage this particular situation.
Yes.
Right, so they've never managed anything having to do with health.
Yes.
Right, so there's certain things that maybe the minister could be excellent at his job, but there's some things that he will never understand.
But what they're saying is that young people like yourself are drawn in by public relations. So
Well,
what you need is more public relations rather
in
than...
that time where image is what matters. So my generation depends heavily on image to make decisions. You know, so what you have to do is couple the image and the presentation with everything else.
Right.
You know, the knowledge, the facts, everything else has to be coupled with it.
And you believe that members of your generation coupling image is
Well,
substance?
if you give us the documents we look
Yes.
my generation is said to not go looking for it.
Right. You have to provide you with information. All
They say
right.
we need it provided to us.
Good.
But I mean, we also have great expectations. We have great expectations of what we
We pick that up when we come back because we now have to look at what was said and presented by COVID in an election, not said by COVID in an election. We are talking about we're going to now be listening to the General Secretary of the party who spoke about, as I understand it, the general elections and why it was called during this period of time. So we now listen to our General Secretary, the General Secretary of the People's National Party. Good enough.
The Prime Minister had until March next year, when the full term of the government would expire. The government and the Prime Minister would have access to data that other persons wouldn't have. And clearly, at the time the election was called, we were experiencing a spike in the COVID cases. Everybody knows the political culture in Jamaica, that, we have nomination day where you have large gatherings, meetings where there are going to be interactions. So inevitably, the campaign is going to contribute to an increase in COVID cases. Now, obviously, as a party, once an election is called, we have to contest it. We don't have an option. But I think the government and the Prime Minister did have an option, and they had information. And from my perspective, they chose what I would consider their own interests over the health and welfare of the majority of the Jamaican people. But we are committed to contesting, we are committed to winning, and we intend to win on September 3rd.
They would have access to all of the information, as was said before. They would know the number of cases. We had a significant backlog. They would have known what time it would take to clear up that backlog. They would have known these things. They also are the ones who are charged to put the necessary measures in place. We cannot govern the country from opposition. And so the governance of the country is based on the government of the day. If they decided to call an election, they should look at the pre-testing protocol, how they're going to amend that to ensure that persons coming into the country are tested. They should also ensure that when persons show up at our borders that they are tested. And how do we put state quarantine and state isolation in place? Within the different parishes, we look at putting cough and fever clinics so that individuals who are presenting with those symptoms can go there and take the burden off the sector. And so a government has to manage and govern a country. That is the duty of the government. The duty of the opposition is to highlight these flaws that they have, to make proposals as to how we can better manage the situation. And if an election is called, we have an obligation to contest the election, observe the protocols that are in place to win that election so we can implement our policies. But we are not going to run scared when an election is called. We are going to contest it, and we're going to contest it to win it.
Right, not just the general secretary of the party, Julian Robinson, talking about I think Dr. Jim Campbell also spoke, so you got a second bite, at the cherry. And we will now move to another segment, and I'm going to tell you the viewers.
I think this is the major part for me and a lot of persons. I see have started the discussion. On this, they want to know what will the PNP do, or what would have the PNP done differently had they been the government. So let's listen to Dr. Maurice Guy and see what he says that the party will do differently.
On the 2nd of June in the Parliament, when we indicated to the Prime Minister that to reopen the borders, we should have pre-testing, they scoffed at that. They said no. So we saw 6 weeks later, when the numbers were rising, that the government introduced pre-testing from 4 states within the United States, and subsequently for those areas, all the areas of the United States plus 3 other countries. Secondly, we made a recommendation about our visitors coming to the island and that they should be tested. That was not taken on board. We have seen since the reopening of the borders that the number of cases coming now, about 50 to 60% are imported, after we did so well from our first case test in March of this year. Now, we are also seeing where our national surveillance at our sentinel sites, that's right across the country, we have about 30 plus sentinel sites where samples are taken, that particular issue, that particular testing and sampling has broken down. Now, as a government in waiting, one of the things that we are committed to do is to beef up the resources. We were misled by the government when we were told that they had adequate testing with a capacity up to 3,000 tests per day. Yesterday was the first time that we ever exceeded 1,500 tests per day. The country was misled by the government in public relations to say we had that capacity, but yet we never tested. My colleague Dayton mentioned about the backlog of over 10,000 cases. We were not told that the numbers were of that magnitude until very late. When it was late, what that has done, it has put pressure on our scarce and our pressured healthcare workers to do the contact tracing. Now, What are some of the solutions that we will have? First of all, I'd invite us to look at our manifesto, but to say that one of the first things we will do in coming to office is to boost the capacity of our testing. We have over 3,000 testing per day. We will ensure that 3,000 tests are done so we don't have a backlog. People will get their results in 8 to 9 hours, so they will have an idea. We'll also look at the possibility, not the possibility, but opening the market to the private sector who have that capacity with PCR machines, and we will also morph the veterinary services, the university, the Ministry of Health, who all have PCR machines to do testing so we can do all the samples that are coming to this country. And further, we will require that those persons who are coming into the country will do a PCR test within 72 hours of arrival here in Jamaica, as well as to screen those who we consider may have the condition on their arrival at the airports. We need to boost our testing capacity. It is futile for us to ask our healthcare workers to grope in the dark to try and find out where these samples, where these infections are coming from, if we do not give them the tool. The first tool that we require to give them is the results of the tests that we do.
That's Maurice Guy, Dr. Maurice Guy, outlining some of the things that the People's National Party will do as it relates to COVID-19. I also want to remind the viewers that our electronic version of our manifesto is now out, and there is a section of it that speaks in a very detailed way to COVID-19 and how we will handle the pandemic in Jamaica. Then as we come to the end of the program, is there anything that you wish to say to us? Excellent. Thank you very much for listening and viewing us.
Building your Kingston, building Clarendon, building your St. Ann, Portland to Westmoreland, building your St. Bess, building St. Catherine, yes, St. Mary now get left, and over to the west, building up St. James, St. Thomas have the wave, building Manchester name, Trelawney we are clear, hey, building your Jamaica, PNP does a build it up, building your Jamaica, PNP does a build it up, build it up, build it up, hospital and school, farmer plant more food, build it up, more factory like a road that improve, build it up, put the X beside the head, that's what you're gonna do, build it up, we are build Jamaica for me and you.
The proceeding was a paid announcement by the People's National Party. The People's National Party.
Building your Kingston, building Clarendon, building your St. Ann, Portland to Westmoreland, building your St. Bess, building St. Catherine, yes, St. Mary now get left, and over to the west, building up St. James, St. Thomas have the wave, building Manchester name, Trelawney we are clear, hey, building your Jamaica, PNP does a build it up, building your Jamaica, PNP does a build it up, hospital and school, farmer plant more food, build it up, more factory like a road that improve, build it up, put the X beside the head, that's what you're gonna do, build it up, we are build Jamaica for me and you.
The proceeding was a paid announcement by the people.